All right, pleasure being here today. Great having everyone on board. And I like the idea that we're gradually networking out a little bit more with our healthcare here in rural America, because it seems to be oftentimes a lot of clinicians and faculty I talk with feel like we're running in isolation at times. And I walked away from a meeting online Monday with HRSA that made me just equally as frustrated, as though rural doesn't exist for whatever reason. So happy to be here to talk about some of the ways we're trying to network and have more of a virtual brain, so to speak, on how we address rural healthcare. First off, I don't have anything to disclose with this. My connection with ECHO is very much like what everybody else who is involved in ECHO is. We're sort of what I like to call a franchise. I started out with ECHO initially underneath the ECHO Institute, but a couple of years ago moved out on our own. And so I'll go through and kind of talk just very briefly about who I am. I sometimes have found that people seem to be more interested in where the heck I suddenly got the crazy idea I knew anything about rural health. So this is a group of people that I worked with here on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. They had a tsunami there about 3 years before we got there, and the place is still being rebuilt, and it was in pretty rough shape, and their healthcare system was really struggling. There was still even a giant Chinese trawler up on the beach there that had been there for 3 years, and nobody yet had figured out how to move the blasted thing off of there, and most of them were eating chips and other high shelf life foods, and were really struggling with nutrition. Here's all of the different practices that I've been in over the years since going through training, the bulk of which are in rural areas. So I've kind of been around the block a little bit with this, a lot of tribal health, things along that line that have informed my practice, a little bit of workers' comp here and there, depending on which clinic I was in. Was even a medical director for a while at Grand Ron for about a year. And then this is just a little bit of comedic relief here. So a little patient here on the left who is not impressed with the fact that I'm about to give him an immunization, as you can tell by his hand gesture there. And the little gal here on the upper right-hand side has my eyeglasses and a tummy tape, trying to mimic what I look like in her opinion. And then here's another group of people that are teaching me how to do. This was my first selfie. And I had to have people in the Dominican Republic show me how to do one. So that's been a little while ago, but kind of funny. So I'm going to do some brief overview of just telehealth in general. It's evolving. We're all becoming more familiar with it, and some of this may be old information for some of us, but others of us may be new. So basically what we're trying to do is we're doing some utilization at a distance of gathering, collecting, and sharing information, and trying to leverage that using current telecommunication technology. It's a variety of different ways that we can do things like enhance care delivery, preferably on the receiving end of that. Although I have to admit, referring back to what Randy was saying, it's amazing how much that we learn at the hub of our echoes from people who ask questions of us, which make us think, hadn't thought about that before. And then you go and look it up and you learn something in the process. So that's very much like having students in clinical practice, which I always enjoy precepting students. And it's also interdisciplinary too. That's one of the big things that ECHO in particular tries to promote, but certainly some of the things we do with some of the programs we collaborate with, such as AHIC in New Mexico. What it is not, it's not a specific clinical service. There are various different people who split hairs with whether the use of telemedicine is appropriate or not with that. And I think you kind of get out in the weeds with it after a little bit, but in general, the consensus is from the national organizations that telehealth is not intended to be telemedicine, and this is not faxes as far as trying to communicate at a telehealth level. Your domains here are fairly common, have been like this for a while. You have the synchronous, like what we're doing right this minute, where we have live video conferencing. You have stored forward. You might not have really thought about it before, but for instance, if if an x-ray gets taken digitally and then it gets sent forward to the radiologist to be viewed, that's considered store and forward. If you have a patient that you're doing a virtual visit with and you take a picture of a rash or lesion that they had and you forward this to the dermatologist or wound care, and then they look at it at a different time, that's an example of store and forward. And we have remote patient monitoring. That would be things like checking an INR at home with a device. You could use some of the earlier examples of monitoring, say a pacemaker or other cardiac implants, would be to hold the phone up next to your chest, and well, a series of signals would go back and forth, not unlike a fax machine. That's evolved quite a bit now to something a little bit different. And then there's mobile health, which is basically mobile handheld devices, as well as having a good current example would be CT scanners now that they have available in some of the major cities, where they can do a on-scene head scan to determine whether somebody's either a bleed or a clot for, say, a CVA, and can go ahead and start TPA in the field, which can be very beneficial for patient care. I don't know that that's something we're going to see in rural America anytime soon, and I doubt anybody's working on an attachment for your iPhone to do that. Telehealth components to consider in the overall health system that you put together where you're doing all this virtual work. Of course, the first thing you need is the telecommunications and link network. That can be everything from being within the clinic or hospital facility that you're working in, and how the computer system operates. It might be a trunk line that goes out to a hard line to the internet, or it might even be Wi-Fi, disk, any number of different things that you might use that are wireless. You have to have, obviously, a user and a provider. So those are, of course, things like the patient and the clinician. Might be two clinicians. It might be a specialist and a ER, things along that line. A mode of delivery, that can be with audio, it can be with camera, it can be things like sharing an image that's digital back and forth. Those are some examples of different types of delivery. There's a process that's involved in this so that everybody's standardized. Not unlike if you think of writing a SOAP note, we all have sort of a tendency to write in general very similarly, so that if somebody else comes along and reads it, they're able to understand what you're trying to say. And in the same way, the processes you use to transfer information back and forth virtually have to have processes in place for not only for consistency in the information, but also in security with HIPAA compliance and things along that line. Oftentimes there's an application that's involved in this. Typically that's some sort of software. For instance, today we could say that part of the application we're using to communicate today would be Zoom. In other people's cases, you might be using Doximity, somebody might be using Skype, any number of other different things, particularly with us having HIPAA relieved for at least the interim during the pandemic. So there's a lot of different types of software available, and certainly that's the way most of the communication occurs. And then there's technical equipment, which might be things like your phone, for instance, that you might be using to talk with somebody. Oftentimes what we're doing, for instance, now is that the provider is maybe doing the visual part of the encounter on their phone, where they've got their EMR opened up on their laptop and they may have it propped up next to it. Those are all pieces of equipment that are involved in that. In a network level, of course, that could be your server. It also has to do with Wi-Fi interfaces, any sort of interface with the internet, whether it's hardline or by satellite dish. And so there are a number of different pieces that are part of that. The microphone, the camera, those are all important pieces too. And you don't have to spend a lot of money to make those things work, but certainly they're very important to have a good picture, particularly when you're dealing with patients, so that they feel comfortable with your interactions. One of the big things that telehealth is really good at is that it tends to improve our efficiency, and it can maintain and in some cases actually improve the quality of care. Excuse me, allergies here in New Mexico. Part of what you may find, for instance, is that you're able to keep more close contact with the patient. You know, they're an elderly person, say, is in a home. You get a better idea of what their home life is like by being involved in a video visit with them, for instance, or even just a phone call. And that in and of itself can give you more opportunities to interact with them and hopefully promote their health care. It allows expertise to be available from just about any place you can get a signal. I've actually at one point called a specialist who happened to be climbing on a mountain, and the phone number they gave me was his satellite phone, which was a little strange. It was like, dude, why didn't you tell me? So whether or not he was had one arm with an ice pick stuck up into the glacier or not, I'm not too sure, but he did go ahead and give me the consult while we were over that. That's the most bizarre one I think I've ever had. He was in South America. And then the cost of the equipment has dropped dramatically, although we very recently spent nearly $1,000 for a really nice OWL video camera, which we can't use now because we're not doing group video. You can, for instance, the camera I've got on right now is about $50 from Best Buy. And if you go out on the internet, on the Amazon or whatever, you can get some really nice stuff. There's some great reviews, CNET, and a handful of other places, as well as a lot of the telehealth organizations are pretty good about making recommendations for that. Reimbursement and funding are changing. It's changing very rapidly right now. Just over the past 4 to 6 weeks, some very significant changes have happened. And even as recent as Monday, we had some more things that were dropped from the feds for CMOS. And so there's a lot of stuff going on as far as changing. Now, what that's going to look like when we get through, that's almost a discussion for another presentation, is going to really change because we've had HIPAA lifted temporarily. And when that gets pressed back in place and clinics are doing processes that are not HIPAA compliant, it's really going to be a problem. And then acceptance is spreading, although I have to admit, after having hands into a number of different clinics and conversations, particularly with the Primary Care Association here and listening to what's going on in some of our rural areas, there's still a little bit of struggle with that. I don't know that we can necessarily associate it with age or I mean, there are multiple components involved in it. And again, that's another discussion altogether. The acceptance is spreading, particularly in suburban and urban areas, and it's a lot of efficiency involved in doing that. But we have a few different issues that we're dealing with in rural, and it's not quite as simple as getting your clinic up and running with telehealth to get that to be really accepted by patients. Models of telehealth or provider to provider, which is essentially what the ECHO is all about. There's provider to healthcare facility to patient, where you might have a patient either in your inpatient facility or even an outpatient facility, and you're have another provider come on and consult with you with the patient there. Occasionally that can happen. It works pretty well. Not unlike if you were to think of an interpreter. If you got an interpreter, the patient, and the provider there, then to some extent that is a sharing of information back and forth that has a third party in it. Outpatient specialty consult. So you might call and have a rheumatologist on when you're talking to a patient, for instance, who's at a metropolitan area and not available where you are locally in your rural area. Inpatient specialty consultation, that could be everything from inside the emergency room. Surgery is another big one they use for those types. So a lot of different opportunities for inpatient use, particularly in smaller rural hospitals that don't have all those specialists. Neuro is probably the most common one that I can think of right this minute. EMS, ER consults while on scene and during transport. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's Detroit has 2 mobile CT scanners that can go to the scene. They can scan somebody, send that back to the ER, and the ER physicians can make some determinations as to whether or not they want to go ahead and proceed with treatment in the field. Family to patient remotely can be very beneficial and something I think we oftentimes will forget about. A common scenario for us here in New Mexico, particularly on the northern half of things, if PEDS is full and we're not able to get pediatric patients into either Presbyterian or UNM, then they'll tend to send them to Denver. And when that child goes to Denver, then they fly them up there, for instance. That doesn't include the rest of the family. And so now you've got a child that's isolated from the family, oftentimes with very little means. So we could set up a video conferencing where they're able to talk back and forth. And then, of course, there's the patient to provider, which is very much what we're seeing now. An outpatient, derm, endocrinology, and psych's been around for decades and actually worked quite well even in the days before Wi-Fi, where we had trunk lines that were hardwired in, and there was a lot of use of that, particularly in the native communities. And it works well at first. That's something that makes you kind of scratch your head. But the idea that you're able to, particularly again in a rural area, if you have a patient who needs to have therapy, there's actually, to some extent, a sense that what they're going to communicate to this person back and forth remotely is less likely to end up working its way into the community. If somebody were to say something about what was going on with them, at least that's the patient's perception of it with most of the studies they've done. So in some sense, there's an added sense of security that somebody remotely they could talk to more frankly and then not be so worried about that information getting out into the community. Specialties that tend not to work well are like orthopedics, rheumatology, and surgery, although there certainly are robotics that are being used now pretty extensively. I have flew with a gentleman from New York who was heading to Seattle who did robotic surgery, and he was going out for the first time after having done several robotic surgeries from New York in Washington, just so he could meet everybody and look over the equipment and make sure everything was put a face on it, so to speak, I think is the way he was putting it. Video interpreting, of course, that's nice to have an additional way of seeing what the patient is, how the patient is responding and communicating back and forth with them. So video interpreting is great because now the interpreter is able to see the person and see their body language. Whereas if you're just on a phone, and I'm sure all of you, if you've ever done this before and had to utilize a telephone for having an interpretation done while you're seeing a patient, you just lay this wireless phone up on the Mayo table and then go at it. And that's not particularly very personable with that sort of thing. And oftentimes I find there's some miscommunication and you never really know as a provider, did that really come off the way you wanted it to? With the addition of video, now the interpreter and the patient can see each other as well as what you've got going on, and then the communication improves significantly as a result of that, and patients are a lot happier with that. So we'll cover some of the issues in telehealth here, including concerns, pitfalls, and benefits. Some of the issues that we have are recommending emergent versus urgent services that are not available locally. So if you're doing a remote virtual visit with a patient and you're in Maryland and this patient is 200 miles outside of Fargo, how is it that that person in Maryland is going to know what's available to send somebody to if you determine during this visit they need emergent or urgent services? So that's one of the concerns that I have oftentimes when I hear that outside agencies, outside the state, so to speak, are providing these services. In some cases, that can be really great, perhaps in an urban or suburban area, but the further you get out from what you would normally to be expected services available in either the urban or suburban area, the more difficult it is for a remote provider to try to figure out where to send somebody safely. Oftentimes, you'll have a client in one state and a clinician in another state or jurisdiction. For right now, that's been lifted. Some of the questions are coming in. They've actually got some agencies who have people that are outside the country who are providing services. And that's underneath debate right now whether or not that counts. But certainly one of the things you want to be careful with, and to break it down to like a nurse practitioner level, here in New Mexico, nurse practitioners have full independent licensure. If we go to Texas, Texas has a supervision that's required for nurse practitioners. So if you're a nurse practitioner in New Mexico and you're seeing a patient who's in Texas, and this is not unusual if you're on one of the border cities there, say like Clovis or something along that line, and the patient's over there, if you do a phone call to that patient, they're physically in that other state, and technically the ability for you to be able to provide services for them is not available because you're not licensed in that state. Again, some of that's been lifted temporarily and it's kind of clouded that up a little bit, but it does present some problems because let's say the patient has a bad outcome in one state and the provider's in another state. What's their recourse for trying to do something about that? So that ends up really creating quite a few problems. Equipment and infrastructure failures can occur. Certainly now that we're seeing a lot of people working at home during the pandemic, the trunk lines on the peripheral area rather than being down in the business areas are getting hit a lot harder. So the communications inside of small cluster of communities has sometimes run into problems because the internet's loaded up heavier than what they could transfer back and forth. That can create problems. You want to make sure you do things like you've got another way to contact the patient or maybe have to do the visit without video. And then of course there's liability, just like what I was implying there. The big thing we want to do is to be sure that we consider our ethical considerations with that, and we want to uphold our current code of ethics that we practice for inpatient no different. We want to make sure that we're abiding by all the rules and regulations that are applied. Again, we're in a twilight zone for the time being during the pandemic. The big thing, and this is a lot of what this is the American Telemedicine Association who puts out these recommendations for this, is that you don't want to use telehealth to avoid in-person encounters based on their geographical location, their social economic status. Let's say you don't want that kind of person in your clinic or something like that. If they have a certain disease, discounting the communicable part of it. If you don't want that person in your clinic, certain disabilities, gender preferences, sexual orientation, behavioral factors, ethnicity, religion, all of that. The exception is that you can avoid contact with people when you do see pandemics or epidemics like what we're seeing right now, to avoid the spread of infectious disease. And that's what a lot of us are doing in our clinics right now, is doing whatever we can to keep from clustering patients together who might potentially cross-contaminate to each other. And payment cannot be, payment cannot be conditional on receiving certain diagnoses or particular treatments, such as a receipt of a prescription. Of course, the obvious one there is like for pain medications or other narcotics that people might be seeking. So you have to be very careful about those sorts of things. We want to abide by a strict interest policy of determine what the sole purpose is of enhancing outcome. And basically what that means is that you don't want to be making a bunch of, doing this to make a bunch of money out of it. So there's a whole list of things here. I've just got my 5 minutes, so I'm going to have to speed it up here a little bit. Emergencies, certainly it can help quite a bit for that. The big thing you have to do is have standard triage protocols. So when you call up and talk to the patient, you determine right off the bat whether or not this is something that can be handled by the video visit. For follow-up, you want to make sure you have knowledge of the patient's healthcare network, so you're sending them to the places that they can actually go to, and be sure that you inform the patient on how that's done. You also want to make them aware of how the data is stored, since we're not recording typically for video visits or for the phone visits. That's considered a HIPAA violation to do that. You can do that to some extent with patient permission, but I won't go into that for right now. Financial impacts you have to consider is a lot of times the money from the local sites end up going into ancillary services and the clinical visit revenue, so you're going to lose some of what you get out of that. Emergency departments benefit a lot with this, particularly for pediatric access, simply because there are a lot fewer pediatricians in ERs, particularly in rural areas, than you'll see in a urban or suburban area. Basically, we find out that patients are a lot happier about this, our care scores are better, and there's usually a lot more efficiency during transport, simply because we're able to determine if they can go local or go further away, which always cranks up the price of transportation. Timely documentation is really important, so you have to be sure that gets put into play. I've been in a number of, as expert witness on a number of cases where people got in trouble because they didn't timely document, so that's something to consider there. And then of course, always consider a backup plan should there be a issue with the patient, where you can contact them perhaps by a landline if they have one in rural areas. We find a lot of people do have still outlines. This is basically on to transform healthcare. There are a lot of new devices that are out, what have you, such as Tidal Care, where we're able to monitor patients in the household. There are a lot of limitations involved in that. Again, that's another presentation altogether. We're doing an ECHO here, a patient-provider presentation today, which speaks specifically to providers, to basically developing this sort of global virtual brain, so to speak, is the way I like to think of it, where we all get to learn from each other. I'll skip over that one. That was a video. Primary care is getting a lot more complicated. I think most of us that are in practice know that, and certainly having access to something like ECHO can really help quite a bit with that. It's hard to keep up with all of that, and it's nice to be able to come in and get some sort of opportunity to get caught up on the latest on your primary care practice. The nice thing about what we're doing here is we've started building this into education, so that not only do clinicians get complimentary CMEs out of this, but when students graduate, they know how to use ECHO or these types of healthcare virtual encounters. things along that line. And this, rather than trying to get somebody to learn about this while they're in the middle of their practice, this gives them the tools up front. We think of it as like learning how to use a stethoscope, otoscope, something like that. It's a tool. You may not need it every day, but it comes in handy. Our clinic is already embedded into 8 different courses. It's also now an interprofessional component for our IPE that we have at the university. We've also expanded out to AHEC hubs around the state. So we have a wide variety of different health sciences, both from students, faculty, and clinician standpoints who participate, which has really made it quite robust over the past couple of years. Here's a couple of examples. I'll leave that for you to peruse with a copy of the slide presentation here, but needless to say, we've really found some interesting ways to use the ECHO model.